They thought they could take everything from him, but what they didn't know was that he held the key to destroying the very thing they valued most: Ezekiel. Carter was not the kind of man who went looking for trouble. He lived quietly, worked his land, and carried himself with the steady patience of someone who had endured too much in life to let petty annoyances shake him. At 65 years old, his back was still strong, his hands still calloused, his stride still purposeful. He had seen storms that tore through crops, banks that tried to choke his family with debt, neighbors who looked at him with suspicion simply because his skin was darker than theirs. Through it all, Ezekiel never broke. He stood just as his father and grandfather had stood before him, rooted to the land they had fought to keep. The barn was the centerpiece of that story. It wasn't just a structure of wood and tin hammered together. It was history. His grandfather, Henry Carter, had built it after coming back from the Second World War, his hands shaking from memories of gunfire but steady when he laid boards and drove nails. Ezekiel could still remember being a boy, running barefoot through the dust while his grandfather stacked hay bales inside the barn. The smell of aged timber, of cattle, of sun-warmed earth, it was a smell Ezekiel carried with him his whole life. His father had repaired the roof a dozen times, patched walls when storms tried to rip them away, and kept it standing strong even as neighbors sold their land to developers. For Ezekiel, that barn wasn't an eyesore, it was a monument. But when the HOA came, none of that mattered. The Homeowners Association had been a whisper at first, forming when a group of wealthy city folks bought up property near the man-made lake just south of Ezekiel's land. They didn't want just houses, they wanted a resort-style community. A jewel in the countryside that would attract investors, weekenders, and people with more money than patience. They built pristine white homes with glossy decks overlooking the lake. They added docks where expensive boats floated lazily on weekends, paved roads, planted artificial lawns, and then came together to form a governing body, the HOA, that would protect their investments. Ezekiel had never been part of their community. His land wasn't in their development, wasn't bound by their rules, and wasn't part of their vision of neat perfection. Still, his barn sat at the edge of their view, and that was enough. The first letter came in the mail, printed on crisp white paper with their logo at the top. Dear Mr. Carter, your property currently contains an unsightly structure that does not conform to the community standards of Lakeview Estates. The letter demanded he voluntarily remove the dilapidated barn within 90 days. Ezekiel had chuckled, crumpled the paper in his fist, and tossed it into the wood stove. The second letter carried threats of fines. The third, a warning of legal consequences. Ezekiel burned each one. But the HOA wasn't a beast that gave up easily. Where Ezekiel saw family history, they saw inconvenience. Where Ezekiel saw pride, they saw a problem. And where Ezekiel stood firm, they decided to push harder. Karen Whitmore was the spearhead of it all. She was the HOA president, a sharp-dressed woman in her late 40s, with a voice that sliced through conversations like a blade. She drove a gleaming black SUV and spoke as if every word she uttered was law. To her, Ezekiel's barn wasn't just a blemish, it was a personal insult. She couldn't host her wine parties by the lake with that rotting old shack in view. It didn't matter that the barn wasn't on their land. It didn't matter that it had stood there decades, before her HOA even existed. To Karen, if something didn't fit her vision of perfection, it had to go. One sunny afternoon, Ezekiel had been mending a fence when Karen pulled up his gravel driveway. Dust swirled around her shiny tires as she stepped out in high heels far too delicate for country soil. She marched straight toward him, clutching a clipboard. "Mr. Carter," she called, her voice echoing. "We've been more than patient. That barn of yours needs to come down." Ezekiel leaned on his hammer, sweat glistening on his brow. "That barn's been here longer than you've been breathing, lady. It's not going anywhere." Karen's lips pressed into a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This isn't about history. It's about community standards. Property values. That barn is dragging down the entire aesthetic of Lakeview Estates." Ezekiel's laugh was low, steady, almost dangerous. "Lakeview Estates can kiss my backside. That barn belongs to me. Not you. Not your little club. Me." Karen's face flushed crimson. She turned sharply, muttering about known compliance and further action, before storming back into her SUV. Ezekiel thought that would be the end of it. That maybe, just maybe, they'd finally leave him alone.
Hey!
How far the HOA was willing to go. One morning before dawn, Ezekiel woke to a deep rumble. At first he thought it was thunder, but when he stepped outside with a mug of steaming coffee, his heart stopped. At the edge of his property were bulldozers and trucks. Yellow machines with flashing lights, men in hard hats moving with purpose. No, Ezekiel muttered, his voice breaking into the cold morning air. No, no, no. He ran toward them, shouting, "Get the hell off my land!" A man in a reflective vest held up a paper. Court order, issued by the county. You can't stop this. Before Ezekiel could process it, before he could fight, the machines roared to life. The ground shook as they moved in. Their metal jaws bit into the barn's sides, ripping through decades of wood and history. Planks splintered, dust filled the air, the sound of cracking beams echoing like gunfire. Across the land. "Stop. That's my family's barn. You've got no right." Ezekiel's voice was raw, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. He lunged forward, but two deputies stood between him and the machines, hands on their hauls. By the time the sun had climbed high into the sky, the barn was gone. Nothing but a pile of shattered boards, broken glass, and crushed memories. Ezekiel stood there in silence, the dust settling around him like ash after a fire.
Ow, neighbor.
Neighbors from the resort homes peeked from their manicured lawns and polished decks, some smirking, some pretending not to notice. To them, it was just another victory for order. To Ezekiel, it was an act of war. He didn't shout, he didn't cry, didn't beg. He just stood, chest heaving, eyes burning, staring at the empty patch of dirt where his grandfather's sweat and his father's pride had once stood. That night, he sat alone on his porch. The stars above seemed cold, indifferent. He turned. The memory over and over in his mind, the sound of the bulldozers haunting him. It had taken something irreplaceable, something sacred. But the HOA had made one fatal mistake. They assumed Ezekiel was powerless. They assumed because they had papers and machines and influence. They had what they didn't know was that Ezekiel carried a secret. Beyond the far edge of his land, tucked away behind thick brush and wild grass, stood an old dam. It had been built generations ago to control the water flowing into the valley. His grandfather had worked on its maintenance when he was young, and Ezekiel had learned every inch of it, every crack in the stone, every hidden valve, every whisper of water. Beneath, most people had forgotten about it. To the HOA, it was just another piece of the landscape, invisible, irrelevant. But Ezekiel knew better. That dam wasn't just stone and steel, it was power. And beneath it, hidden from careless eyes, was the master release valve. Old, rusted, stubborn, but still functional. They had demolished his barn. They had erased his family's monument. But Ezekiel, he held the key to erasing the very thing the HOA valued most, their glittering, man-made lake. He set his coffee cup down, leaned back in his chair, and let a slow smile spread across his face. The war had only just begun. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it creeps in silently, like water filling a basin before it overflows, steady and unstoppable. After the barn was gone, Ezekiel didn't make a scene. He didn't storm into county offices or file lawsuits he knew would go nowhere. The system was never built to protect men like him. And he'd learned long ago that fighting on their terms meant fighting battles already lost. Instead, he did what he'd always done. He watched, listened, and waited. The HOA, meanwhile, carried themselves as though they had won some grand victory. Within days of the demolition, workers cleared the rubble, hauling away the last pieces of Carter family history as though they were trash. The ground where the barn had stood was scraped clean, bare dirt yawning in place of heritage. Ezekiel couldn't walk past it without his stomach tightening, his chest burning. But if the HOA had been smug before, now they were unbearable. The weekend after the demolition, they held a lakefront gala. Loud music floated across the water. Champagne corks popped, laughter echoed into the night. Strings of lights hung over their freshly polished decks, and boats bobbed lazily in the shimmering lake. Ezekiel stood on his porch, his weathered arms crossed over his chest, staring across the water. He could see Karen Whitmore at the center of it all, dressed in a sparkling gown, glass of wine in hand, laughing too loudly at something another homeowner said. Protecting investments, she called it. Upholding standards. Ezekiel spat into the dirt beside his boot. To him it was gloating. Dance on his grandfather's grave. That night, when the noise of the party finally faded and the stars stretched across the sky in silence, Ezekiel walked out past his property line. The moon lit his path as he pushed through the brush, branches scratching at his arms. He knew exactly where he was going. He had walked this trail since he was a boy, following his grandfather to the dam whenever repairs were needed. The dam loomed out of the darkness, stone and concrete rising like a silent sentinel. Most people had forgotten it was even there, hidden by decades of overgrowth, neglected by the county that should have cared for it. But Ezekiel hadn't forgotten. He knew every sound it made, every creak, every whisper of water against its walls. He crouched by the master valve, brushing away the moss and dirt that had gathered over the years. His lantern cast a warm glow over the rusted steel wheel, its surface pitted with age but still intact. Fingers tightening around the cold iron. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice in the night air. Land and water, Zeke, they'll fight you for it, but remember, those two belong to no man. The words settled deep in his chest. He closed his eyes and imagined the lake draining, imagined the look on Karen's face when her empire of smug satisfaction turned to mud. He imagined the homeowners screaming when their precious boats sat stranded on cracked ground, but he didn't turn it. Not yet. Instead, he sat there for hours, staring into the darkness, listening to the steady hum of water beyond the dam. By dawn, he returned home, the decision heavy in his chest. The next day, the HOA struck again. Ezekiel received a letter delivered by certified mail, invoice for demolition services, $14,327 due within 30 days. They expected him to pay for the destruction of his own barn. He sat at his kitchen table, unfolded the letter, and laughed a hollow, bitter laugh that scraped at his throat. He ripped the paper into shreds so small, the wind carried them away like dust. 2 days later, another notice arrived. Failure to pay would result in further actions, including potential seizure of additional property. The gall of it made his hands shake. Not only had they destroyed his barn, but now they dared to threaten his land. That evening, he returned to the dam. This time there was no hesitation. He brought with him a heavy wrench, same one his father had used to fix tractors decades ago. He pressed it against the rusted bolts, gritted his teeth, and pushed. The valve groaned, stiff from years of stillness, but Ezekiel's arms were forged by decades of work. Muscles strained, sweat dripped down his forehead, and finally, with a shriek of metal, the wheel began to turn. A hiss of pressure escaped first, then a rumble that built into a roar. Water surged through channels long dormant, rushing into the creek bed below. The sound was deafening, wild, alive. Ezekiel stepped back, his chest heaving as he watched the dam release its hold. By morning, the lake had dropped 3 feet. Residents noticed immediately. Shouts echoed across the manicured lawns as homeowners stumbled out of their houses, squinting at the waterline. Boats sat lower, docks jutted awkwardly above the shrinking surface. Panic rippled through Lakeview Estates. Karen called an emergency HOA meeting that very day. Ezekiel didn't attend, but he didn't need to. Could hear the raised voices from across the water. There must be a breach. One homeowner shouted, "We need engineers." Another cried. Karen stood at the head of the table, her voice clipped but cracking under the strain. "This is temporary. We'll fix it. Do not panic." But by the second day, the lake dropped another 3 feet. The smell of mud began to rise, foul and sour in the summer heat. Fish flopped helplessly in shallow pools near the banks, gasping for air. The docks no longer touched the water. They dangled uselessly above cracked earth. Boats tilted on their sides like discarded toys. Panic became outrage. Homeowners yelled at Karen, demanding answers. Calls were made to county officials, but the dam was old, records scarce. No one knew how to stop what was happening. By the third day, the lake was a wasteland. What had once been the glittering jewel of their community, the centerpiece of their luxury, was now a reeking swamp. Birds circled overhead, scavenging dead fish. The resort's booking office lit up with cancellations as word spread. Investors backed out, guests demanded refunds, and the community's shining reputation collapsed almost overnight through it all. Ezekiel sat on his porch, sipping his morning coffee, watching the chaos unfold across the water. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He simply watched with the calm patience of a man who knew justice when he saw it. Neighbors from the resort homes sometimes caught sight of him, sitting there like a sentinel, unmoved by the disaster. Some swore they saw the corner of his mouth twitch upward, the faintest glimmer of satisfaction. But no one dared confront him, not yet. The HOA called in experts. Men in hard hats and clipboards who muttered about valve failures and structural instability. They scrambled to stop the drain, but the damage was already done. The water wasn't coming back quickly, not in weeks, maybe not even in months. And by then, the community would be ruined. Ezekiel's land remained untouched. His crops grew. His cattle grazed, and every evening he'd walk down to the creek that had come alive again. Rushing strong with the water once stolen to feed the lake, da-da! The earth seemed to breathe again, as though freed from the weight of false luxury. The HOA had thought they could take from him with no consequence, but they had never understood who they were dealing with. They had demolished. His barn, Ezekiel, had drained their world, and the war was far from over. Some battles end with signatures on paper. Others end with silence so loud it drowns every lie. By the fourth week, Lakeview Estates was unrecognizable. The glittering lakefront community that had been marketed as a jewel in the countryside was now a scar on the land. The water had drained so far that the lake bed cracked under the sun, splitting into jagged patterns of dried mud. The expensive docks the HOA had bragged about sat stranded in the middle of dirt fields, boats once symbols of leisure and wealth, tilted at awkward angles on their bellies, their hulls creaking as though they too mourned their fate. The air reeked of rot from the dead fish, and clouds of flies buzzed in swarms, thick enough to make residents gag when they stepped outside. The people who had once thrown lakefront parties now locked themselves inside their pristine homes, blinds drawn, trying to block out the sight of what had become of their paradise. But the silence didn't last long. Panic gave way to anger, and anger needed a target. Homeowners turned on Karen Whitmore. At an HOA meeting that stretched late into the night, tempers flared hotter than the summer air. "You said this place was an investment?" one man shouted. His tie loosened and sweat dripping from his forehead. "I put $500,000 into this property. Now it's worthless. You promised this was permanent lakefront property," another woman cried, tears streaking her makeup.
"All my family
"Moved here for the water, and my kids are playing in mud." Karen, her perfect hair no longer perfect, tried to keep her composure. "We are doing everything in our power. The county's investigating. We've brought in engineers." "Engineers?" her man sneered. "They told us it could take years to restore the water if it ever comes back." "You've ruined us, Karen. You've ruined all of us." Fingers jabbed at her. Voices rose. Threats filled the air. Lawsuits were promised. Accusations hurled. Karen slammed her gavel down, her voice shaking, as she shouted for order, but the authority she once wielded had evaporated, leaving only desperation. Meanwhile, Ezekiel sat on his porch across the waterless expanse, sipping his coffee every morning like nothing had changed, except everything had. Where the HOA saw disaster, Ezekiel saw balance being restored. The creek that once ran dry now flowed again, weaving through his land with a strength that hadn't shown in decades. His cattle drank from it, his crops soaked up its nourishment. It was as though the land itself had chosen sides, rewarding him for his patience and punishing the arrogance of those who thought they could control nature. One afternoon, Ezekiel heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He set his mug down and rose. Slowly, as a black SUV came rolling up his driveway, its glossy paint now dulled by dust. The driver's door swung open. Out stepped Karen Whitmore. She didn't look like the untouchable queen of Lakeview Estates anymore. Her eyes were ringed with sleepless shadows, her posture stiff but brittle. She marched up his steps in heels that sank into the dirt, waving her manicured finger at him. "You," she hissed. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Ezekiel leaned against the porch post, his face calm, unreadable. "Ma'am, I don't know what you're talking about." Her voice rose. "Don't play games with me. You've been here your whole life. You know that damn better than anyone." She flung her arm toward the cracked wasteland where the lake had been. "This is your doing." Ezekiel tilted his head, studying her like one might study a storm rolling in the distance. His voice was quiet, measured. "That dam's been there longer than you, longer than your fancy houses, longer than your club. If the water decided it wanted to leave, maybe it was just time." Karen's face twisted with rage. "You've destroyed everything. You understand? Property values have plummeted. People are bankrupt. Our entire community is collapsing." Ezekiel's gaze hardened, his jaw set like stone.
Oh.
"My barn was everything to me. You destroyed it. My grandfather's hands built it. My father bled to keep it standing, and you tore it down like it was trash. You thought there'd be no price? Well, there's always a price." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy as thunderclouds. Karen opened her mouth to scream again, but her words faltered. The way Ezekiel stood there, unflinching, unmoved, unnerved her. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't threatening. He was simply telling the truth, and she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. Finally, she spat her last venom. "You'll pay for this. The law will catch up with you. Don't think you've won." Ezekiel gave the faintest shake of his head. "Lady, the law never cared for me. But the land, the water, they remember. They've already decided who won." Karen turned on her heels, storming back to her SUV. The tires kicked up dirt as she sped away, but the hollowness in her eyes had told Ezekiel everything. She was finished, and she knew it. Weeks bled into months. The county sent surveyors, engineers, and crews, but nothing could undo what had been done. The water had carved new paths, feeding streams and rivers it once abandoned. The lake bed cracked deeper under the heat of summer, weeds sprouting where fish once swam. Property after property went up for sale, each one fetching a fraction of its former worth. Some homeowners walked away in ruin, leaving behind empty shells of luxury that no one wanted. Lakeview Estates became a ghost town. Ezekiel, however, rebuilt not. The barn, because no structure could ever replace what was stolen. Instead, he built a workshop with his own 2 hands, simple and sturdy, with wide doors and a roof strong enough to withstand storms. He planted fruit trees in neat rows beside it, young saplings that promised life for years to come. Every nail, he hammered every seed he planted, was a reminder that destruction doesn't always mean the end. It can also mean the beginning of something. Stronger, neighbors who remained often glanced toward his land, some with suspicion, others with quiet respect. A few even approached him, humbled, asking if he knew how to coax the land into health again, how to work with the soil instead of against it. Ezekiel offered advice sparingly, not out of spite, but because he knew only time could teach the lessons. His family had learned through struggle. The HOA was dissolved within 6 months. Karen Whitmore disappeared from public life, her name dragged through lawsuits and scandal until she was nothing more than a bitter memory. One crisp morning, as the sun painted the horizon in gold, Ezekiel sat on his porch with his coffee steaming in his hand. He looked out over his land, over the creek that still sang with fresh water, over the fruit trees swaying gently in the breeze. The silence was deep, but it wasn't empty. It was peace, the kind of peace earned only by standing firm when the world tried to break you. The dam still whispered in the distance, a constant reminder of the choice he had made. To some, it might have seemed destructive. To Ezekiel, it was balance. The land had spoken, and justice had been delivered, not through courts or laws, but through the simple truth that arrogance always drowns itself in its own reflection. They had demolished his barn. They had tried to erase his history, his pride, his family's legacy. But in the end, it wasn't Ezekiel who was erased. It was them. Because sometimes justice doesn't need a gavel or a jury. Sometimes justice is the sound of water rushing free, the silence of those who thought they owned. It all in the sight of a man who refused to bow, finally sitting in the sunlight, unbroken. The end.